My name is Catalina Teliban. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Bucharest, and today I will be presenting my paper, Writing as a Means for Resilience in the Face of Adverse Childhood Experiences, in Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being. From a psychological perspective, much can be said on the topic of heavy childhoods, as childhood represents the foundational basis for the future of any person, and therefore the presence or absence of heaviness plays a crucial role in obtaining a well-adjusted development. Bearing this in mind, in my presentation, I focus on the concepts of adverse childhood experiences and intergenerational trauma in relationships in order to explore the way in which these notions interconnect and determine the future of children. As a case study, in order to apply these concepts, I utilized Ruth Ozeki's 2013 novel A Tale for the Time Being, a complex story told primarily through the point of view of 16-year-old Naoko Yasutani, by means of her diary entries, through which the author delves deep into the topic of intergenerational relations and adversity, and, in my opinion, negotiates the way in which the former can aid in healing the latter. Specifically, I aim to demonstrate that writing becomes a means of resilience for Nao in the face of her adverse childhood experiences. In order to do this, I begin by providing a definition of the notions I look at in the presentation, adverse childhood experiences and intergenerational trauma, then continue by explaining how the relationship between Nao and her father shapes the direction of her life. I then move on to establish intergenerational relationships at large, and how they function as a foundational bridge between the characters, and finally demonstrate how writing helps Nao make sense of both the adverse experiences, intergenerational trauma, and intergenerational relationships as a whole, thus strengthening her voice and position and ultimately providing her with not only self-awareness but also resilience. In order to do this, I utilize the close reading approach by applying the theoretical notions to the analysis of the text as I go. So, to begin with, I will provide a very brief and concise summary of the aspects of the novel which are most relevant to my presentation. As mentioned previously, the novel explores the psychological and social challenges faced by Naoko, or Nao, a 16-year-old Japanese-American girl who is relocated to Tokyo after the loss of her father's job. Nao's life is marked by a series of adverse experiences and traumatic events, which include her difficult home environment attributed to her father's severe depression, which is characterized by repeated suicide attempts, and her experience with ijime at school, a form of intense bullying and abuse verging on the point of torture. I have an excerpt from the novel which says, "I basically got tortured. In Japan they called it ijime, but that word doesn't begin to describe what the kids used to do to me." So, the narrative is constructed through Nao's diary entries, which come about as a result of her decision to write down an account of her great-grandmother Jiko's life, whom she admires the most in the world. From the beginning of the narrative, Nao makes clear her intention to use the diary as a place to tell Jiko's story, and after she is finished, commit suicide. This is an important detail to which I come back later in my presentation. So, the notion of adverse childhood experiences refers to a tool utilized in psychology in order to establish a connection between recurring traumatic events which take place during childhood and their effects on a person's life both in childhood and well into adulthood. The ages that this applies to range between 0 to 17, with the effects of these adverse experiences lasting potentially for life, as seen in Johnson et al. Nao's experiences happen between the ages of 15 to 16, and they include a series of events which are categorized in the list of adverse childhood experiences, such as mental illness in the household members' repeated suicide attempts, emotional neglect, school violence, maltreatment by teacher, and poverty. These are a series of adverse childhood experiences which I found in various scientific sources and which completely match Nao's experience. Throughout the novel, it is made clear in various ways that these experiences worsen Nao's mental state to the point of turning her suicidal, which makes clear the notion's importance in investigating the character's trajectory. As for intergenerational trauma, as kindly highlight, it began as a term which described the transmission of collective trauma across generation, but then it was extended to include individual experiences of trauma outside of the context of structural oppression. Therefore, particularly in more recent times, intergenerational trauma, which is used interchangeably with transgenerational trauma in certain scientific papers, has been used to describe the way in which trauma circulates within families from one generation to the other, irrespective of whether or not the trauma has to do with historical contexts or individual familial case by case contexts. In Ozeki's novel, there appears a blend between the two instances. In Nao's life, particularly, it has to do with her household's issues, but in the family at large, it also includes the trauma of the Second World War, which affects her great uncle, who is named Haruki number one, as well as her father, who she sometimes refers to as Haruki number two. Let her highlights the fact that transgenerational transmission is a necessary condition for any individual in group development, as it gives a feeling of continuity, attachment, and security, which are fundamental for healthy development. The problem is that traumatic experiences, emotions, and coping mechanisms associated with any traumatic event or process might be unconsciously repeated. Thus, it becomes obvious that the concept of intergenerationality holds a double meaning, a positive one and a negative one. A positive one because it is a definite requirement in healthy development, and a negative one when it can produce repeated patterns of harmful behavior, which is not always the case, but which is relevant for the novel that I propose for analysis. In the novel, intergenerational relationships function as the core issue in Nao's life, but also as the key to healing. Evidently, the relationship to the primary caregivers, which are the parents in Nao's case, is the most important aspect in the welfare of children and their sense of security and control. It is important to note that lack of family support in the presence of recurring adversity has an impact on children's perceptions of the world around them, thus increasing the risk of developmental, behavioral, and physical health problems. This is a key idea for understanding Nao's descent into mental instability and suicidal ideation, as Nao's relationship to her parents represents a core concern in the novel, as I am going to show presently. So, neither parent manifests a good enough relationship towards Nao, and both could be described as emotionally absent and neglectful. Her mother neglects her ever since moving to Japan, as she is preoccupied by her own worsening mental state. So we can see that we have a double presence of household mental issues, both in the mother and the father. And I have a direct quote from the novel. Mom was never at home at the time. Now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure she was having a nervous breakdown at the time. Upon finding out about Nao's ijime at school and seeing the cuts that her classmates made on her thighs and arms, she first suggests that she is not trying hard enough to make new friends, which, inadvertently or not, suggests that it is Nao's fault for what she is going through. She then attempts to talk to someone at school about it, but does not afterward follow through and ask Nao if the situation improves or not, thus establishing the attempt to help as insufficient and ineffective, reinforcing even more for Nao the idea that she is on her own and there is no help that can come. I already thought my father was insane because this was at a time when I still believed that only insane people try to kill themselves. But at the back of my mind, I guess I was hoping that my mom was normal and okay again. But at that moment, I knew she was as crazy and unreliable as my father, which meant that there was nobody left in my life I could count on to keep me safe. Her relationship to her father is the most complex one in the novel and arguably the crux of the story itself. In the beginning, after moving back to Japan, Nao and her father have a secure and close-knit relationship, where Nao constantly feels that they are both feeling the same thing and rejoices in the idea that she is not alone in her feelings, despite this being negative ones. I'm pretty sure we were both feeling the same things, she says at some point. So we see that her father walks her to school, shows affection, positive reinforcement, and is overall there for her, making him a figure of safety in her eyes, even if they do not feel secure enough to bring up the issues that they are facing. We were totally lying, but it was okay. Even if we couldn't talk frankly to each other, I still liked that my dad walked me to school every morning because it meant that the kids couldn't start picking on me until after he'd waved goodbye and turned the corner. So even if her father is not emotionally available enough to openly discuss the issues that they are facing, she still sees him as a figure of safety at this point in the story. However, After more time passes and their economical situation does not improve, as her father is unable to find a job, his mental state worsens to the point of causing the first suicide attempt when he jumps in front of a train. This marks a turning point not only in Nawa's relationship to her father, but also to her mother, who resolves to pretend that it was only an accident, despite all of them being conscious that it was not. After this, her father becomes a recluse, and her mother is forced to take a job in order to support her family, thus making them even more neglectful of Nao, whose torment at school continues and whose mental stability worsens as well, feeling convinced that she cannot count on her parents for help and retreating into herself in a similar way to her father's own behavior towards himself. Two more suicide attempts happen in the novel, the second one being stopped by Nao herself, who finds her father after he had taken pills and calls the ambulance. So it is important to note here, and what I am trying to illustrate, is that Nao's own behavior is affected by the worsening environment at home and also by the torture she faces at school, and she becomes violent towards one of the weaker classmates and then engages in sexual risk behaviors, beginning to spend time with hostesses at maid cafes who set her up on dates, effectively engaging in prostitution, which she is apparently aware of, judging by her discussions about this in the diary entries. So, both the violence towards others and the violence towards herself by putting herself in these dangerous positions are directly connected to the adverse experiences, which often appear in correlation to each other, as we see in studies such as Hills et al.'s. So this clearly shows how these adverse and heavy experiences shape Nao's trajectory. I find it particularly important to note that as the situations continue to unfold and progress, Nao begins to mirror her father's behavior, enforcing the notion of intergenerational transmissions of harmful patterns of behavior that I brought up earlier. So, not only does Nao become suicidal, just like her father, but she also begins to mirror and almost inadvertently mimic his negative behavior towards her by she herself becoming harsh and callous towards him, as well as a response to how he treats her and as a way to punish him. However, it can also be said that Nao's mirroring of her father's emotional state begins even earlier than this, because in the beginning, when their relationship was still good, Nao derives that her father feels hopeful and she herself also feels hopeful and describes these things. Afterwards, when he retreats into himself, she also starts to retreat into herself, and so on. So I find that this highlights the importance of the intergenerational and parental relationships, as her father's behavior becomes a clear guide of Nao's own behavior, for better or for worse. I have mentioned before that Nawa's diary was meant to be a narration of her great-grandmother Jiko's life. However, as it can be noted from my analysis so far, it is clear that Nawa's own life problems take center stage whenever she finds herself writing in the diary, and all the entries turn into account of her own life and feelings. Furthermore, oftentimes throughout the novel, Nawa catches herself as she slips into narrating her own life and straying farther and farther away from the aforementioned goal, trying then to return to it with the phrase, "Where was I?" And I have noted on the slide just a few of the instances where this appears in the novel. Um, and it becomes almost a chorus for every time she slips into her own story and tries to revert back from it, just highlighting how often this happens. Thus, Nawa's biography turns into an autobiography, with the life writing taking the shape of a journal, which she continuously uses in order to not only express herself and narrate the events, but also gain more insight into them. Oftentimes, after describing instances with her father, for example, the next entry consists of now explaining and giving more context to the events, to the imagined you of her writing. For instance, after describing her father's more and more reclusive behavior, she returns to the diary to add that I said that my father had withdrawn from the world and became a hikikomori, but I don't want you to get the wrong idea. My dad loved me and he wanted me to be safe, she says. So, this over-explaining can lead to two different inferences at once, I believe. One, that after writing her account in the journal now ponders the events described to a deeper level and is thus able to arrive at various conclusions about what she has described. And two, that this wrong idea that she is worried that the reader might get, in fact represents her own ideas about her father, which she is trying to somehow overcorrect because she believes that she is being too harsh towards him. And thus she is trying to reinforce his positive qualities and feelings towards her, such as that he loves her. The most important turning point for Nao's life is her relationship to her great grandmother Jiko, whose importance she herself correctly assesses all throughout the narrative. Through her, Nao finds out more about her great uncle, who shares her father's name, and who, for the beginning part of the story, Nao thinks was a suicidal pilot or a kamikaze. The intergenerational similarities are evident not only through the sharing of the name, but the sharing of the suicidal burden as well, which Nao clearly sees, as does her father. The great uncle becomes a bridge between Nao and her father, as they are both fascinated by him and both derive various connections to him. Nao's diary, which is written in the cover of a French book, is assimilated to his diary, which he writes in French, and both of them are concerned with hiding. And her father's worries about military violence are assimilated with his uncle's same worries as he is forced to be a kamikaze. So through him, Nao and her father are able to connect both metaphorically and literally when they find his journal and begin to translate it together, bonding even more and arriving at the resolution that they must live and carry on. So I believe that this shows how intergenerational relations become the key to healing both their relationship and each other, as the relative similar concerns is able to move them through time and reestablish their connection and change their worldview. So, as such, as most other things in the novel, the role of writing is twofold as well. For now, as great uncle, journaling represents a way to stay true to himself, but unbeknownst to him, at the same time, the same journal would come to be a way to heal Nao and her father in the future. Moreover, Nao's journaling endows her with more awareness of her own feelings and voice, and becomes the only safe space that she has where she feels she can expose her feelings when her parents are not there to help her. Nao's imagined reader becomes a savior for her, a person whom she can trust when she feels that her parents have lost their trustworthiness. As Whitfield assesses, to heal from trauma, the experiencer has to be able to grieve the associated pain. So for now, her diary entries become the only place where this grieving can happen, thus serving as a path towards healing. Arguably, the uncle's journal becomes a shared place for grief for both Nao and her father, but also a shared space for familiar support, because they are shown that their feelings are understood both by each other and by their ancestor. So, all of these factors, writing, familial support, intergenerational relations, build resilience both in Nao through the entire narrative, as we see that she is able to carry on in the face of all the numerous adversities, but also in her father, as in the end, inspired by her great grandmother's last words, he is the one to tell her, "It's like Grandma Jiko wrote, Nao-chan. We must do our best. We must live, Naoko. We have no choice. We must soldier on." So, therefore, the narrative shows the importance of intergenerational relationships, as in the end, these relationships are what save both Nao's father and Nao herself. However, it is important to note that in my reading of the events, Nao's own power is gained through her writing and journaling, and it is what facilitates all of these events happening, as she is the one who is ultimately able to connect both her father and herself to their ancestors, effectively changing their paths. So, what begins with Nao mirroring her father's behaviors for better or worse ends with both of them finding the path towards healing. And I have a quote here to end. I nodded, barely daring to breathe, as the fish in my stomach thrashed its tremendous tail and twisted up into the air. Then, with a great splash, it re entered the water and swam away. Slowly, the water settled. My fish would live, and so would me and Dad, just like my old Chico wrote. And these are my works cited. Thank you for your attention. I hope it has been clear. And once again, thank you very much.